He never expected to find her on the side of the road, but when the injured woman he just saved looked up at him, he realized she's the ruthless CEO who fired him and destroyed his life years ago. Now, as the past collides with the present, the question is, can he forgive the woman who ruined him, or will revenge take its toll? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The windshield wipers squeaked rhythmically as Daniel Harper navigated his old pickup truck through the stormy evening. Rain pelted against the glass in heavy sheets, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the winding road that led to his modest home on the outskirts of town. His shoulders ached from a long day of bent-over work under car hoods. The auto repair shop had been especially busy today, 3 transmission repairs and a stubborn timing belt that had taken hours longer than expected. But thoughts of Lila waiting at home brought a tired smile to his face. His 15-year-old daughter always had dinner ready when he worked late, though he'd told her countless times she didn't need to worry about him. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the truck. Daniel slowed down even more, squinting through the rain. The last thing he needed was to end up in a ditch on a night like this. That's when he saw it, a flash of pale color against the darkness at the side of the road. He might have missed it entirely if not for another bolt of lightning that lit up the scene. There was someone lying in the grass just off the shoulder. Daniel's heart jumped into his throat. He pulled over immediately, throwing the truck into park and grabbing his flashlight from the glove compartment. The rain soaked through his jacket the moment he stepped out. "Hello?" he called out, jogging toward the still form. "Can you hear me?" It was a woman, unconscious and lying face down in the mud. She wore an expensive-looking business suit that was now completely ruined. A deep gash on her forehead was still bleeding. Daniel quickly checked her pulse. It was steady. He gently turned her head to make sure she could breathe properly. Her skin felt cold and clammy under his fingers. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" He tried again, but got no response. The nearest hospital was 40 minutes away, and the local clinic would be closed due to the flooding. Daniel knew he had to make a quick decision. He couldn't leave her here in this storm. With careful movements, he slipped one arm under her knees and the other behind her shoulders, lifting her as gently as possible. She was lighter than he expected, her head lolling against his chest as he carried her to his truck. The rain continued to pour down mercilessly. Getting her into the passenger seat was awkward, but he managed it, making sure to secure her with the seatbelt. Her breathing remained steady, which gave him some comfort. The drive home took twice as long as usual as he navigated the treacherous roads with extra caution. When they finally pulled up to his small ranch house, the porch light was on, casting a warm glow through the rain. Daniel carried the unconscious woman inside, calling out to his daughter as he entered. "Lila, I need some help here." Lila appeared from the kitchen, her eyes widening at the sight before her. "Dad, what happened?" "Found her on the side of the road," Daniel explained, carefully laying the woman on their worn but comfortable couch. "Get me some towels and the first aid kit, please." Lila rushed to comply while Daniel checked the woman's vital signs again. Her pulse remained steady, but her skin was ice cold. He grabbed the old quilt from the back of the couch, the one his mother had made years ago, and covered her with it. "Here," Lila said, returning with an armful of supplies. She helped her father clean the cut on the woman's forehead, revealing an elegant face beneath the mud and blood. Daniel couldn't help but notice the quality of her clothes, the tailored cut of her jacket, the designer label visible on the inside collar. Her manicured hands bore a single platinum ring. Everything about her screamed wealth and sophistication, making their humble living room seem suddenly shabby in comparison. "I'll make some soup," Lila offered, heading back to the kitchen, in case she wakes up hungry. Daniel nodded absently, his attention still on their unexpected guest. The storm continued to rage outside, rain lashing against the windows while thunder rolled overhead. He went to the kitchen to heat some water for tea, taking in the homey scene, Lila stirring a pot of chicken soup, the familiar scent of herbs filling the air. Their visitor's expensive suit and refined appearance felt oddly out of place in his simple home, with its well-worn furniture and family photos on the walls. What was someone like her doing out here, so far from the nearest city? He had a feeling there was more to this story than a simple accident in the rain. For now, though, all they could do was wait for her to wake up and hope the storm would pass soon. Daniel returned to the living room with a cup of hot tea, just in case she regained consciousness. The woman remained still, her breathing deep and regular, while the storm raged on outside their windows. The woman stirred on Daniel's worn leather couch, a soft moan escaping her lips. Her expensive silk blouse was stained with mud, and a nasty bruise was forming above her right temple. Daniel knelt beside her, carefully examining the injury. The swelling didn't look too severe, but he knew head wounds could be tricky. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the modest living room with its mismatched furniture and family photos. His eyes drifted to the simple wooden coffee table where Lila's latest school picture sat in a dollar store frame. His daughter's bright smile beamed back at him, her missing front tooth giving her that adorable, mischievous look that always warmed his heart. More family photos decorated the walls, they Brasidio, memories of happier times. There was one of him and Lila at the state fair last summer, cotton candy stuck to her cheeks. Another showed them building her science fair project, both covered in glue and glitter. Simple moments that meant everything to him now. The woman's eyelids fluttered. Daniel grabbed a clean cloth from his kitchen and dampened it with cool water. As he pressed it gently against her forehead, she began to come around. Where am I?" Her voice was weak, but carried a hint of authority even in her confused state. "You're safe," Daniel said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "I found you by the road. Your car went into a ditch. The storm's pretty bad, and the clinic's closed, so I brought you to my house." She tried to sit up but winced, pressing a manicured hand to her head. "Everything's spinning." "Take it slow," Daniel advised. "You took quite a hit to the head. Can you tell me your name?" The woman blinked several times, seeming to gather her thoughts. Catherine Langford. I'm the CEO of Langford Enterprises." Daniel's hand froze mid-motion. The cloth he was holding dripped onto the floor, but he barely noticed. That name, that face. 10 years had passed, but he'd never forgotten the woman who destroyed his career with a single signature. His mind flashed back to that day, standing in her corner office on the 35th floor. The Seattle skyline spread out behind her desk like some sort of royal backdrop. She hadn't even looked up from her papers as she'd informed him his position was being eliminated. 15 years of dedicated service, dismissed with a wave of her hand. Now here she was, lying helpless on his couch, completely unaware that the man tending to her wounds was the same engineer whose life she'd upended. The irony might have been funny if it didn't make his stomach churn. "Langford Enterprises," he repeated, fighting to keep his voice neutral. "That's quite impressive." Catherine pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "Everything's so fuzzy. Was anyone else hurt? In the accident?" "No. You were alone when I found you." Daniel stood up, needing to put some physical distance between them. "Let me get you some water." In the kitchen, he gripped the edge of the sink, taking deep breaths. The old anger bubbled up inside him, anger at how that firing had started a domino effect that had cost him everything. His savings had drained away during months of unemployment. His house had gone into foreclosure. He'd had to pull Lila out of her private school and move them to this small town for a fresh start. But he was different now. His faith had taught him about grace, even when it was difficult, even when every instinct screamed for justice. Daniel filled a glass with water and returned to the living room. Catherine had managed to sit up, though she still looked disoriented. Her designer clothes were rumpled, her carefully styled hair in disarray. She looked more human somehow, more vulnerable than she had in that tower of glass and steel a decade ago. "Thank you," she murmured as he handed her the water. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me." She took a small sip. "Do you live here alone?" Daniel's eyes flickered to Lila's photo. "No, with my daughter. She's at a friend's house tonight." "That must be nice," Catherine said, her voice softening. "Having family close by. My work, well, it doesn't leave much room for that sort of thing." She looked around the room, taking in the family photos. "You seem to have a lovely life here." The bitter irony of her words made Daniel's jaw clench. If she only knew how hard he'd had to fight to rebuild any semblance of a lovely life after she'd torn his previous one apart. But he held his tongue. "It's simple," he said. "Finally. But it works for us." "Sometimes simple is better," Catherine said, touching her head gingerly. "I'm sorry, I don't think I caught your name?" Daniel hesitated. It would be so easy to tell her, to watch recognition dawn in her eyes, to make her face what she'd done. But something held him back. Whether it was wisdom or cowardice, he wasn't sure. "It's not important," he said, handing her another glass of water. You should rest. The storm should pass by morning, and then we can get you wherever you need to go." Catherine nodded slightly, then winced at the movement. She settled back against the couch cushions, her eyes already growing heavy. Daniel watched her drift off to sleep, his emotions churning like the storm outside. Here was the woman who had changed the course of his life with a single decision, now completely at his mercy. Yet instead of satisfaction, he felt only a complicated mix of anger and pity. And underneath it all, a nagging question: what was God's purpose in bringing her here, of all places? Daniel moved through his modest kitchen with practiced efficiency, pulling out a loaf of homemade bread and some leftover chicken soup from the refrigerator. The soup had been yesterday's dinner, made from scratch like his mother had taught him. As he warmed it on the stovetop, the familiar aroma filled the small space. "I hope you don't mind something simple," he said, keeping his voice neutral as he stirred the pot. Storms made it impossible to get anything else. Catherine sat at his small oak kitchen table, her fingers absently tracing the worn grain of the wood. She'd cleaned up as best she could in his bathroom, but her designer clothes still bore the marks of her accident. "Anything warm would be wonderful, thank you." The silence between them felt heavy, filled only by the steady drumming of rain against the windows and the gentle clink of the spoon against the pot. Daniel pulled 2 mismatched bowls from the cabinet, the kind you'd find at a thrift store, and filled them with the steaming soup. "It smells delicious," Catherine said softly as he set a bowl in front of her. Her hands wrapped around the warm ceramic, and something in her posture seemed to relax. "I can't remember the last time I had homemade soup." Daniel cut thick slices of bread and placed them on a chip plate between them. "It's nothing fancy, just something my daughter enjoys on cold nights." "You have a daughter?" Catherine's eyes brightened with genuine interest. "Yes, Lila. She's staying at a friend's house tonight for a sleepover." He was grateful for that small mercy. He wasn't ready to explain to his daughter who this woman was, or what she'd done to their family. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Daniel couldn't help but notice how Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the spoon to her lips. Whether from the accident or something else, he wasn't sure. "This is wonderful," she said after a few bites. "There's something so comforting about it." She paused, staring into her bowl. "I've been eating at fancy restaurants for so long, I'd forgotten how good simple food can taste." Daniel watched as she tore off a piece of bread, noting how different she looked from the powerful executive he remembered. Her shoulders carried a weight that hadn't been there before, and the lines around her eyes spoke of more than just aging. "Things have changed a lot for me," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "A year ago, I was dining in 5-star restaurants, making deals worth millions. Now," she gave a hollow laugh, "now I'm grateful for a stranger's kindness and a bowl of homemade soup." Something in her tone made Daniel's chest tighten. Despite everything, he recognized the sound of someone who'd hit rock bottom. He'd been there himself, though for very different reasons. What happened? He found himself asking, even though he knew he should keep his distance. Catherine wrapped her hands tighter around the bowl, as if drawing strength from its warmth. "Corporate scandal, betrayal from someone I trusted, the whole company came crashing down." She shook her head. "The worst part is, I didn't see it coming. I was so focused on success, on climbing higher, that I missed all the warning signs." Daniel felt an unwanted flicker of sympathy. He remembered reading about Langford Enterprises' collapse in the news, but he'd been too caught up in his own struggles to pay much attention. "The things that seemed so important then," she continued, "the power, the money, the status, it all feels so empty now." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for this. Not just the food, but for helping me when you found me. Most people wouldn't have stopped." Daniel stood up abruptly, needing space from the vulnerability in her voice. "I'll check on the storm," he said, moving toward the back door. The night air hit him like a cold splash of water as he stepped onto the covered porch. The rain was still coming down in sheets, and thunder rolled in the distance. He gripped the porch railing, trying to sort through his jumbled emotions. Here was the woman who derailed his life, sitting at his kitchen table, humbled and grateful for his help. The anger he'd carried for so long felt heavy in his chest, but alongside it was something else, a reluctant understanding that people could change, that life had a way of teaching hard lessons to everyone. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the flooded yard. Daniel watched the rain pour down, remembering his mother's words about how God's grace often came disguised as difficulties. He'd chosen to help Catherine despite their history, and now he had to trust that decision was the right one. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and pine needles, familiar and grounding. Through the kitchen window, he could see Catherine still sitting at his table, her head bowed over the bowl of soup as if in prayer. The sight stirred something in him. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first seedling of compassion. The morning sun filtered through the living room windows, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. Daniel had barely slept, spending most of the night in his old armchair, keeping watch over his unexpected guest. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp, clean morning air that carried the scent of wet earth through the slightly opened window. He watched as Catherine stirred on the couch, her designer clothes wrinkled from sleep. She looked different in the morning light, more human somehow, less like the corporate titan he remembered from his past. The bruise on her forehead had darkened overnight, a purple reminder of her accident. "How are you feeling?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice neutral. He'd made coffee, and the pot gurgled softly in the kitchen behind him. Catherine pushed herself up to sitting position, wincing slightly. "Better, I think, though my head still hurts." She touched the bruise gingerly. "The storm, is it over?" "Cleared up about an hour ago." Daniel handed her a glass of water and 2 aspirin. "Roads should be passable soon. I can take you to the clinic to get checked out properly." "Thank you." She accepted the pills gratefully. "You've been very kind. Most people wouldn't take in a stranger like this." Daniel moved to the kitchen, busying himself with pouring coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. "It's what anyone would do," he replied, though they both knew that wasn't necessarily true. The morning silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle ticking of the old wall clock. Catherine sipped her coffee, her movements careful and measured. Daniel noticed how she held the chipped mug like it might break, so different from the confident executive he remembered. The storm was quite severe. She said, attempting small talk. "I suppose I'm lucky you found me when you did." "Yes," Daniel agreed, simply standing by the window. He could feel the weight of their unspoken history pressing down on him, his duty to help her ward with his memories of that day 10 years ago, when she'd called him into her office and ended his career with a few simple words. Catherine set her coffee down, her fingers trembling slightly. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the family photos, the worn furniture, the toys scattered in the corner. Something shifted in her expression, recognition dawning slowly like the morning sun outside. "This place," she started, then stopped. Her gaze settled on a framed engineering degree hanging on the wall, partially hidden behind a newer family photo. The color drained from her face. Daniel watched as she connected the dots, saw the moment when past and present collided in her mind. His hands tightened around his coffee mug. "You're..." Catherine's voice wavered. "You're Daniel Harper?" The name hung in the air between them, heavy with a decade of unspoken pain. Daniel didn't answer immediately, letting the silence confirm what she already knew. "I remember now," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "The engineering department, the downsizing." Her voice trailed off as the memory surfaced. Daniel set his mug down with deliberate care, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Yes, I was senior project engineer, until you decided I was, what was the term? Redundant to the company's future goals." Catherine's face had gone pale beneath her bruise. She reached for her purse with shaking hands. I should compensate you for your trouble, for helping me, for letting me stay here." She pulled out her checkbook, a gesture so reminiscent of her corporate persona that it made Daniel's jaw clench. "How much would be appropriate? 5,000? 10? Her pen hovered over the check, but her hand was unsteady. Something snapped inside Daniel. All the carefully contained anger of the past decade threatened to break free. He took a deep breath, remembering his daughter sleeping upstairs, remembering his faith that had carried him through the darkest days after his firing. "Some debts," he said, his voice low and bitter, "can't be paid in cash." Catherine's hand dropped, the checkbook falling limply into her lap. The morning sunlight streaming through the window seemed colder now, highlighting the vast distance between them, the gap between her world of corporate decisions and bottom lines, and his world of honest work and simple faith. The ticking of the clock grew louder in the strained silence. The coffee in their mugs had grown cold, untouched and forgotten, like the remnants of the polite conversation they'd tried to maintain. Everything had changed with the recognition of who they were to each other, victim and perpetrator, the fired and the one who had done the firing, bound together by an act of roadside mercy neither of them had anticipated. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking each heavy moment as Daniel stood by the kitchen counter, his hands gripping a fresh cup of coffee. Catherine sat at the small dining table, her own untouched coffee growing cold before her. "You don't understand what your decision did to me," Daniel said, his voice tight with emotion. "One day I was planning my daughter's future college fund, and the next, I could barely afford groceries." Catherine's perfectly manicured fingers traced the rim of her coffee mug. "The company was going through restructuring. We had to make difficult choices." "Difficult choices?" Daniel's laugh was hollow. "I had a mortgage, a 5-year-old daughter. My wife had just—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "You didn't even give me a chance to explain or defend myself. Just a pink slip and a security escort out of the building." Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, highlighting the stern lines around Catherine's mouth as she listened. Her usual commanding presence seemed diminished in the humble surroundings of Daniel's kitchen. "I remember that day," she said quietly. "You were one of many. At the time, I told myself it was just business." She met his gaze, guilt flickering in her eyes. "I convinced myself that everyone would land on their feet somehow. That's what we tell ourselves in corporate, isn't it? To make the hard decisions easier?" Daniel set his coffee cup down with more force than necessary. "Well, I didn't land on my feet. I crashed. Hard. Do you know what it's like to tell your kindergartner that she can't have new shoes because daddy lost his job? To watch your savings disappear month by month?" Catherine's face paled. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I truly am. But at the time, I believed your beliefs cost me everything." He cut in. "Everything except my daughter." The conversation fell into heavy silence. Catherine dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her usual polish cracking under the weight of confronting the human cost of her past decisions. Later, as Catherine dozed on the couch, Daniel stood at the living room window, watching birds hop across his small front yard. 10 years of bitterness sat like a stone in his chest. He'd rebuilt his life piece by piece, learned auto repair from YouTube videos, worked double shifts at the local garage, eventually saved enough to buy his own shop. But the anger had never truly faded. The sound of footsteps on the stairs drew his attention. Lila appeared, her dark hair still messy from sleep, wearing her favorite oversized sweater. "Morning, Dad," she said, giving him a quick hug. Her eyes darted to Catherine's sleeping form. "How's she doing?" "Better," Daniel replied, keeping his voice neutral. "The storm's passed, so she'll probably head out soon." Lila studied his face with that perceptive look that sometimes made her seem older than 15. "You're worried about something." "Just tired, sweetheart." He forced a smile. "There's cereal in the kitchen." As Lila disappeared into the kitchen, Catherine stirred and sat up slowly. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, her makeup slightly smudged, a far cry from the polished executive who'd once stood in a boardroom and changed his life with a single decision. "Your daughter?" she asked softly, nodding toward the kitchen. "Yes, Lila. She seems lovely." Catherine smoothed her hair, attempting to regain some composure. "How long have you lived here?" 8 years, Daniel replied. "Found work at the local garage. Eventually bought it when old Joe retired." "You're a mechanic now?" Surprise colored her voice. "That's quite a change from engineering." "You do what you have to do." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "I understand that better than you might think." She twisted her hands in her lap. "My own life. It's not what it used to be either. My husband left 3 years ago. My children barely speak to me anymore. They blame me for choosing the company over them." She gave a bitter laugh. "Turns out I was good at making hard decisions for everyone except myself." Daniel found himself sitting in the armchair across from her. "Your kids, how old are they?" 23 and 20. They're in college now. Well, Marcus is. Sarah dropped out. Catherine's voice caught. "I haven't seen them since last Christmas. They sent cards, at least." The morning sun filled the room with warm light, and for a moment they sat in silence, two people who had once been on opposite sides of a corporate decision, now finding common ground in their shared experience of loss and loneliness. "Sometimes," Catherine said softly, "I wonder if all those hard choices were worth it. The company still fell apart in the end. Everything I sacrificed, my marriage, my relationship with my children, the lives I affected, like yours, it all seems so pointless now." Daniel watched as a tear slipped down her cheek. The sight stirred something unexpected in him. Not forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps the first crack in the wall of resentment he'd built around his heart. "Lila," he called out, "Would you bring our guest some coffee?" The familiar sound of his daughter's footsteps approached from the kitchen, carrying with her the promise of a new day and, perhaps, the possibility of healing old wounds. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Daniel methodically packed Lila's lunch for school, his movements automatic after years of routine. He glanced at the closed guest room door where Catherine was staying, his jaw tightening slightly. After seeing Lila off to school, Daniel busied himself with household tasks, trying to keep his mind occupied. He folded laundry, straightened the living room, and prepared a light breakfast for his unexpected guest. When Catherine emerged from the guest room, she moved slowly but seemed stronger than the day before. "You don't have to keep helping me," Catherine said, easing herself into a kitchen chair. "I can manage." Daniel set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her. "The storm's still pretty bad. Roads are flooded. You should rest until things clear up." Catherine picked up her fork, her hands trembling slightly. "I've imposed enough already." "It's fine," Daniel replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. He turned to the sink, scrubbing a pan with more force than necessary. Throughout the morning, Catherine insisted on proving her recovery by walking around the modest house. Daniel watched her from the corner of his eye as he did some paperwork from the auto shop, ready to help if she stumbled but maintaining his distance. Around noon, Daniel prepared a simple lunch of soup and sandwiches. As they sat at the kitchen table, the rain drumming steadily on the roof, Catherine broke their uncomfortable silence. "I lost everything, you know," she said quietly, stirring her soup. "The company, my reputation, my family's legacy, all of it gone." Daniel looked up, surprised by her openness. He remained silent, waiting. "There was an executive, someone I trusted completely." Catherine's voice grew bitter. "He had been manipulating accounts, making backroom deals. By the time I discovered what was happening, it was too late. He'd already covered his tracks and shifted the blame." Daniel set down his spoon, memories of his own career's sudden end flooding back. "When did this happen?" 3 years ago. Catherine's eyes grew distant. "The same man who convinced me to." She hesitated, looking at Daniel. "To let you go. He said you were a liability, that you'd discovered irregularities in the books. I believed him without question. I was so focused on protecting the company, I never stopped to investigate properly." Daniel felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding began to take root. The Catherine before him was different from the cold CEO he remembered. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, her carefully maintained image cracked. "I started a nonprofit after that," she continued, "helping displaced workers find new opportunities. It doesn't make up for what I did, but—" She trailed off, pushing her bowl away. Daniel cleared his throat. "Why were you on that road yesterday?" "I was visiting one of our outreach centers in the next town over. I should have checked the weather forecast." She attempted a weak smile. "Not very CEO-like of me, was it?" Before Daniel could respond, they heard the front door open. Lila's voice called out, "Dad, I'm home early. They canceled afternoon classes because of the flooding." Daniel stood quickly, but not before Lila appeared in the kitchen doorway. She froze, her backpack sliding off her shoulder to thump against the floor. Her eyes darted between her father and the stranger at their table. "Who are you?" Lila asked, her voice sharp with surprise and suspicion. Catherine straightened in her chair, summoning her most welcoming smile. "Hello, Lila. I'm Catherine Langford. Your father has been kind enough to help me after I had an accident in the storm." Lila's eyes narrowed, and she moved closer to Daniel. "How do you know my name?" "Your father mentioned you," Catherine said softly. "He's very proud of you." Daniel placed a gentle hand on Lila's shoulder. "She needed help, sweetheart. The roads were too dangerous to get her to the clinic." Lila shrugged off his hand, her protective instincts clearly visible in her rigid posture. "How long is she staying?" "Just until the weather clears," Daniel assured her, recognizing the worry in his daughter's voice. Catherine stood carefully, smoothing her wrinkled blouse. "Your father has been very generous. You're lucky to have him." Lila moved slightly between Catherine and her father, her teenage face a mask of barely concealed hostility. "Yeah, I know. We're fine on our own." The kitchen fell silent except for the persistent rain outside. Daniel could feel the tension building as Lila stood her ground. Catherine remained awkwardly standing, and he found himself caught between them, uncertain how to ease the mounting discomfort in the room. As the days melted into each other, the tension in Daniel's small home began to shift. Catherine's bruises faded from angry purple to softer yellows, and her steps grew steadier. She spent more time in the living room, where Lila would often sit doing her homework after school. "What subject is that?" Catherine asked one afternoon, noticing Lila's furrowed brow as she stared at her textbook. "Algebra." Lila sighed, tapping her pencil against the page. "I'm usually good at math, but these word problems are tricky." Catherine smiled softly. "Mind if I take a look?" "I used to help my niece with her homework." Daniel watched from the kitchen doorway as Catherine settled beside Lila on the couch. His daughter, initially stiff and guarded, gradually relaxed as Catherine walked her through the problems step by step. Their voices mixed with the gentle ticking of the wall clock, Lila's quick questions, Catherine's patient explanations. "You're really good at explaining things," Lila said, closing her textbook an hour later. "Way better than Mr. Peterson at school." Catherine laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise even her. "Well, when you've spent years breaking down complex business proposals, algebra starts to feel simple in comparison." Daniel noticed how Lila's eyes lit up with curiosity. "What kind of business did you run?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. Catherine's smile faltered slightly as she glanced at Daniel, who had tensed visibly. "It was a technology company?" Catherine answered carefully, "but that was a long time ago." Later that evening, after Lila had gone upstairs to bed, Catherine found Daniel in the workshop attached to the house. He was bent over an old radio, his skilled hands working to bring life back to its silent speakers. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the rain that had started to fall outside. "I need to say something." He didn't look up, but his hands stilled on the radio's circuitry. "I know I've said I'm sorry before," Catherine continued, wrapping her arms around herself. "But I need you to understand how deeply I regret what happened. Not just firing you, but the way I handled everything. I was so focused on climbing higher that I forgot to look at who I was stepping on along the way." Daniel finally turned to face her, his expression guarded but attentive. "I wish I could go back," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "Change how I handled things, but I can't. And I know that no amount of apologizing can undo the damage I caused." The workshop fell silent except for the steady drumming of rain on the metal roof. Daniel studied the screwdriver in his hands, turning it over slowly. "You know," he said finally, his voice low but steady, "sometimes when I'm fixing things in here, I find parts that seem beyond repair, rusted, broken. But with enough care and the right approach, even those pieces can find new purpose." Catherine's eyes widened slightly at his words. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was something close to hope. They moved to the kitchen, where Daniel started preparing a simple dinner of grilled cheese sandwiches. The familiar motion seemed to help him find his voice. "After you fired me," he began, keeping his eyes on the skillet, "everything fell apart. I couldn't find work in engineering. Your recommendation made sure of that. We lost the house, had to pull Lila out of her school. She was only 5 then, but she knew something was wrong." Catherine sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she listened. "We ended up here because it was all we could afford," Daniel continued, flipping the sandwiches. "I started working at Joe's auto shop, learning the trade from scratch. Spent nights studying repair manuals while Lila slept on a mattress in our one-room apartment. He placed a plate in front of Catherine before sitting down with his own. The hardest part wasn't the money, though. It was watching my daughter try to be brave when I knew she was scared. Hearing her tell other kids her dad was a mechanic like it was something to be proud of, even though I knew she remembered when I was an engineer." "She is proud of you," Catherine said quietly. "Anyone can see that." Daniel took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. "Took me a long time to be proud of myself again, to see that maybe God had a different path in mind for me. This town, this work, it's not what I planned, but it's become home." They ate in companionable silence, the kitchen warm against the cool spring night outside. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking moments that felt somehow significant in their simplicity. "Thank you," Catherine said as she finished her sandwich, "for telling me this, for helping me understand." Daniel nodded, gathering their plates. Maybe understanding is where healing starts. The evening settled around them like a gentle blanket, full of unspoken possibilities. Neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring. But for now, they had found a quiet peace in their shared meal and honest words. The kitchen was quiet, except for soft clinking dishes and running water. Daniel scraped leftover lasagna into a container, movements mechanical after years managing household chores alone. Evening light filtered through the window, casting shadows across worn linoleum. "Let me help," Catherine said, appearing in the doorway. She wore borrowed clothes, an old t-shirt and sweatpants that made her look ordinary, far from the corporate executive he remembered. "That's not necessary," Daniel replied automatically, voice lacking its usual edge. "You should rest." "Please," she insisted. "I've been resting for days. I need to do something useful before I go stir-crazy." Daniel hesitated, then handed her a dish towel. "You can dry." They fell into easy rhythm, him washing, her drying. The silence felt different now, less charged with old hurts, more contemplative. "You have a wonderful daughter," she said softly. "She reminds me of myself at that age, before everything got complicated." Daniel nodded, scrubbing a stubborn spot. "She's the best thing in my life." "I can see that." Catherine paused, fidgeting with the towel. "I've been thinking about all my mistakes. About what happened with you." Daniel's hands stilled in soapy water, chest tightening. "I trusted the wrong people," she continued, voice thick with regret. "I was so focused on climbing higher, proving myself, that I didn't see what was happening. Do you remember Marcus Thornton?" The name hit Daniel like a blow. "The VP of Operations? The one who presented evidence against you?" Catherine finished. "What I didn't know was that he'd fabricated everything. He was embezzling and needed a scapegoat." Daniel turned off the faucet, but the audit showed exactly what he wanted it to show. Catherine's laugh was bitter. "He was brilliant at manipulation. I believed him because he'd been my mentor. 3 years later, he did the same to me. Only then, he'd gotten greedy." The scandal was massive, front-page news everywhere. Daniel dried his hands slowly, processing this. The man he'd blamed had been a puppet master, pulling strings neither had seen. "By the time truth came out, damage was irreparable," Catherine continued. "The company was in shambles, thousands lost jobs, and my reputation." She trailed off, twisting the towel. "But my biggest regret isn't that I lost everything. It's that I failed to protect people who trusted me, people like you." Her voice cracked, and Daniel saw tears. This wasn't calculated remorse. This was raw, genuine pain. "I should have looked deeper, questioned things," she went on. "Instead, I took the easy way out. I convinced myself it was just business. But I was wrong, Daniel. So terribly wrong." Daniel studied her face. The sophisticated executive was gone, replaced by someone who looked as broken as he'd felt. "What happened after?" "After the scandal?" Catherine wiped her eyes. "I lost everything. Position, reputation, friends. It took months to clear my name legally, and by then, nobody cared about truth. That's when I started the foundation. I couldn't undo what happened, but I could help others who'd been displaced." The kitchen fell silent, but the air felt clearer somehow, as if a storm had passed. Daniel found himself remembering the day he'd been fired, the look in Catherine's eyes. He'd always interpreted it as cold indifference, but now wondered if it had been uncertainty, maybe fear. "Thank you," he said finally, "for telling me the truth." Catherine nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "I should have told you years ago, should have found you and explained. But I was ashamed. And then?" She gestured vaguely. "Life sweeps you along, doesn't it? Until suddenly years have passed, and good intentions are just that, intentions." Daniel watched her turn away, shoulders trembling. He thought about all the anger he'd carried, how it had colored every memory. Now, looking at Catherine, really looking, he saw someone who'd been just as much a victim. Heading to his room that night, leaving Catherine on the couch, Daniel felt lighter. The bitterness he'd nursed had begun loosening its grip. Perhaps Catherine wasn't the villain he'd made her out to be. Perhaps, like him, she was just someone trying to find her way back from loss and betrayal. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Daniel prepared breakfast, the familiar routine of cracking eggs and brewing coffee, bringing a sense of normalcy to what had become an unusual situation. Catherine sat at the small kitchen table, looking stronger than she had in days, though dark circles still lingered under her eyes. "I never thought I'd find such peace in simple moments like this," Catherine said, wrapping her hands around a steaming mug of coffee. Her designer clothes had been replaced by borrowed casual wear, making her seem more approachable, more human. Daniel glanced at her as he flipped an omelet. "Sometimes the simple things are all we need." "You know, after everything fell apart at Langford Enterprises, I had to completely reshape my life," Catherine continued. "That's when I started the nonprofit. We help workers who've been displaced by corporate downsizing, teaching them new skills, helping them find jobs." She paused, stirring her coffee. It's my way of trying to make things right. Daniel set a plate in front of her, his movements careful and measured. And how's that working out? It's different from running a corporation. The rewards aren't measured in profit margins anymore. A small smile touched her lips. Last month, we helped 20 families get back on their feet. The look in their eyes when they land a new job, that's worth more than any quarterly earnings report. Though Daniel nodded, his expression remained guarded. He'd seen too many corporate promises turn to dust to fully trust her words. Still, he couldn't deny the sincerity in her voice. As they ate in companionable silence, Catherine's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, her face clouding over as she recognized the number. "Excuse me," she said, rising from her chair. "I need to take this." Daniel watched as she stepped into the living room, her posture stiffening as she answered the call. Even from the kitchen, he could see the color drain from her face as she listened to whoever was on the other end. "That's impossible," she said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "All our paperwork is in order. We've been completely transparent about." She fell silent, listening intently. "No, you don't understand. Those funds were properly allocated. Every penny has been accounted for." Daniel found himself holding his breath, recognizing the tone of someone receiving devastating news. Catherine's free hand gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles white with tension. "I'll need to see the documentation," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I understand the implications." The call ended, and Catherine stood motionless, staring at her phone as if it might bite her. "Bad news?" Daniel asked, though the answer was written clearly across her face. Catherine turned to him, and for a moment she looked as vulnerable as she had the night he found her in the rain. "They're investigating the foundation," she said, sinking into the nearest chair. "Someone's claiming we misappropriated funds meant for worker training programs." Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing his arms. "Is there any truth to it?" "No!" Catherine's response was immediate and fierce. "I've learned my lesson about cutting corners. Everything we do is by the book." She ran a hand through her hair, a gesture of frustration that seemed out of place on the usually composed woman. "But they're freezing our accounts while they investigate. We have families depending on those programs, people who are just starting to rebuild their lives." The irony wasn't lost on Daniel. The woman who had once carelessly disrupted lives was now desperately trying to save them. He watched as Catherine's shoulders slumped, the weight of this new burden evident in every line of her body. "I thought I was finally doing something right," she said quietly. "Making amends for all the harm I caused. But it seems like no matter what I do, the past won't let me go." She looked up at Daniel, her eyes glistening. "Maybe this is karma, paying me back for all the lives I ruined, including yours." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, torn between his lingering resentment and the unexpected compassion he felt watching her struggle. The proud CEO he'd once known was gone, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely determined to make a difference. "What will happen to the people in your programs?" he asked. "Without funding?" Catherine shook her head. "They'll lose everything. The training, the support services, the job placement assistance, it all requires money." She pressed her fingers to her temples. "I've been there myself, watching everything you've built crumble around you. But this time, it's not just about me. There are families counting on us." The kitchen fell silent, except for the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Daniel could see Catherine's strength wavering, the confident facade cracking under this new pressure. Despite his reservations, despite the years of anger he'd carried, he couldn't help but recognize the genuine pain in her eyes. "I should make some calls," Catherine said, pushing herself to her feet. Her movements were slow, heavy with the weight of this new burden. "There has to be something I can do to fix this." Daniel watched as she walked toward the guest room, her shoulders bent as if carrying an invisible load. The woman who had once seemed untouchable, who had wielded corporate power without a second thought, now looked as broken as he had felt all those years ago. The memory of his own downfall stirred in his mind, the sleepless nights, the uncertainty, the struggle to provide for his daughter. Yet here he was, watching the architect of that suffering face her own moment of reckoning. The feelings that welled up inside him were complicated, a mix of sympathy and lingering hurt that he wasn't quite ready to resolve. The days following the phone call brought a visible change in Catherine. Her usual composed demeanor crumbled, replaced by a woman who seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. She spent more time in the guest room, barely touching the meals Daniel brought her. Daniel watched from the doorway as Catherine sat by the window, staring blankly at the rain outside. Her laptop lay closed beside her, untouched for hours. The sight stirred something unexpected in him, concern for the woman who had once seemed invincible. "She's been like that all morning," Lila whispered, appearing at his side. His daughter's brow furrowed with worry. "Should we do something?" Daniel squeezed her shoulder. Sometimes people need space to process things. But Lila, with her teenage determination, had other ideas. That afternoon, she knocked on Catherine's door carrying a plate of freshly baked cookies. "I made these in home ec today," she announced, setting them on the bedside table. "They're chocolate chip. Everyone likes chocolate chip, right?" Catherine managed a weak smile. "That's very kind of you, Lila. Want to help me with my math homework? Dad's hopeless at algebra." Lila perched on the edge of the bed, her textbook already in hand. "I don't know if I'd be much help right now," Catherine replied, her voice distant. She turned back to the window, leaving Lila's hopeful expression to fade. Later that evening, Daniel's phone rang. It was Jim Preston, owner of a prestigious auto shop in Boise. "Been hearing good things about your work, Harper," Jim said. "Got an opening for a master mechanic. Better pay, full benefits. Could be a fresh start for you and your girl." Daniel's heart raced. This was the kind of opportunity he'd been waiting for, a chance to give Lila a better life, maybe even send her to college someday. But as he glanced toward the guest room where Catherine stayed, doubt crept in. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Don't take too long," Jim replied. "Offer's good for a week." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, calculator in hand, running numbers. The salary increase would make a real difference. They could afford a nicer apartment, maybe even start saving for Lila's future. But something held him back. The thought of Catherine, broken and alone, trying to save her foundation. The next morning, while Daniel worked on a customer's car, Lila burst into the garage. Her face was red, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded. Daniel set down his wrench. "Tell you what? About Catherine. I heard her on the phone talking about how she fired you from your engineering job. How you lost everything because of her." Lila's voice cracked. "Is that why we moved here? Because she ruined your life?" Daniel's heart sank. He'd wanted to protect Lila from this truth, to let her form her own opinions about Catherine. "It's complicated, honey." "No, it's not. She hurt you, Dad. She hurt us." Lila wiped angrily at her tears. "And now she's staying in our house like nothing happened?" "She's changed," Daniel said softly, though even he wasn't sure he believed it completely. "I thought she was different. I thought she was our friend." Lila's shoulders slumped. "But she's just another person who let us down." Before Daniel could respond, Lila turned and ran from the garage. He heard her bedroom door slam moments later, sound echoing through their small house like a gunshot. Daniel stood in the hallway, caught between his daughter's room and the guest room where Catherine stayed. The job offer weighed heavy in his pocket, an escape route from this complicated situation. But as he listened to Lila's muffled sobs and thought of Catherine's lost expression, he realized there were no easy answers. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. His faith had always guided him to help those in need, but now that same principle was tearing his family apart. The woman who had once destroyed his career now needed his help, while his daughter, the center of his world, felt betrayed by her very presence. The sound of movement from Catherine's room made him open his eyes. He could hear her soft footsteps, probably having heard Lila's outburst. The gentle click of her door closing again told him she'd chosen to stay put, perhaps understanding that her presence would only make things worse. Daniel stood in that hallway, paralyzed by indecision. The job offer represented a chance to start fresh, to leave behind the ghost of his past. But walking away now, when Catherine faced her own crisis, felt wrong somehow. Yet his daughter's pain was real and raw, a reminder that his decisions affected not just him, but also the person who mattered most in his life. The hallway had never felt longer, the distance between the two doors stretching like an impossible chasm he had to bridge. In one room, his daughter nursed a fresh wound of betrayal. In the other, a woman fought to preserve a foundation built on redemption. And in the middle stood Daniel, a man whose path to forgiveness had suddenly become much more complicated. The morning sun filtered through the garage windows as Daniel worked on Mrs. Peterson's old Buick. The familiar smell of motor oil offered strange comfort. Here, among tools and machinery, problems had solutions. Parts could be fixed. He'd been at it since dawn, escaping the tension filling his house. The rhythm of repairs quieted his mind, checking spark plugs, replacing filters. Each task required focus, leaving little room for complicated emotions plaguing him. Through the window, he could see Lila's bedroom curtains still drawn. She hadn't come down for breakfast, and he hadn't pushed her. The soft click of heels broke his concentration. Catherine stood in the doorway, looking more like her old self in fresh clothes, though her eyes carried new weariness. "Mind if I join you?" she asked hesitantly. Daniel straightened, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Suit yourself." He turned back to the engine. Catherine walked closer, fingers trailing along a workbench. "I used to watch my father work on cars. He owned a small repair shop before he passed." Daniel's hands stilled. In all the years he'd known her as his boss, she'd never mentioned her father. "Didn't know that. There's a lot we didn't know about each other." Catherine picked up a wrench. "I was so focused on climbing the corporate ladder, I forgot where I came from, forgot what it meant to work with your hands." Daniel continued working, but slowed, allowing her words to fill the space. The company's collapse wasn't just about money. Catherine's voice caught. It was betrayal. Thomas Jensen, my CFO, he'd been cooking books for years. By the time I discovered it, the damage was done. Daniel's jaw tightened at Jensen's name, the same man who had convinced Catherine to fire him. He framed good people, covered his tracks with layoffs. Catherine's hands trembled. "I trusted him. I let him convince me that cutting loyal employees like you was necessary." But he was protecting himself, making sure no one looked too closely at the numbers. Daniel straightened, really looking at Catherine. The polished executive was gone, replaced by someone who looked as lost as he'd felt after losing his job. When it crashed down, I finally understood what I'd done, not just to the company, but to people, to families. Her eyes met his, to you. Silence stretched between them, filled only by distant birds and ticking engine parts. "I'm sorry, Daniel, not just for firing you, but for not seeing the truth sooner." Daniel leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. The anger he'd carried felt different now. You know what the hardest part was? Not the job loss. It was explaining to Lila why we couldn't afford her dance classes anymore, why we had to leave her friends behind. Catherine nodded, eyes glistening. "I lost everything, too. My reputation, savings, marriage. But the worst part was realizing how many lives I'd affected without knowing it." Her pain mirrored his own, the shame of failure, the weight of responsibility, the struggle to rebuild. They'd both been victims of Jensen's corruption. "The foundation was my way of trying to make things right," Catherine continued. "Helping displaced workers, providing job training. I thought if I could prevent others from going through what you did." She shook her head. "And now that might be gone too." After a long moment, Daniel picked up his tools. "Hand me that socket wrench." Catherine passed him the tool, and they worked in companionable silence, the tension between them shifting into something like understanding. When the sun began to set, Daniel stepped outside. The evening air was cool, and stars appeared in the darkening sky. He leaned against the wall, eyes tracing familiar constellations. Catherine's story had complicated everything he thought he knew. The neat categories of victim and villain had blurred, leaving messier truth that people are more complex than we want to believe. Looking up at the vast stars, Daniel felt small but lighter. The anger he'd carried was a heavy burden, and while it wouldn't disappear overnight, he could feel it loosening its grip. True forgiveness wouldn't come from Catherine's words or his determination. It would take time, understanding, and willingness to see beyond the past. The stars continued their silent vigil as Daniel stood there, knowing the path forward would require more than accepting apologies. It would mean opening his heart to healing, not just for himself, but for everyone involved. The morning light streamed through the kitchen windows, casting a warm glow on the worn wooden table where Daniel, Catherine, and Lila sat in uncomfortable silence. The only sounds were the quiet clink of spoons against cereal bowls and the gentle hum of the old refrigerator. Lila kept her eyes fixed on her breakfast, occasionally shooting wary glances at Catherine before quickly looking away. Her long brown hair fell forward, creating a curtain between herself and the woman who had caused her father so much pain. Catherine cleared her throat softly. "The weather's supposed to be nice today," she said, attempting to break the tension. Daniel nodded without looking up. "Should make for good working conditions in the garage." "I was thinking." Catherine hesitated, pushing her half-eaten toast around on her plate. "Now that I'm feeling better, maybe it's time I started making arrangements to head back." Daniel's hand paused midway to his coffee cup. He felt Lila's eyes on him, watching for his reaction. The thought of Catherine leaving brought a mix of relief and unexpected disappointment that he wasn't ready to examine. "You've both been so kind," Catherine continued, her voice softer now. "But I can't impose forever. The foundation needs me, and there's work to be done." Lila's chair scraped against the floor as she stood abruptly. Without a word, she carried her bowl to the sink and disappeared upstairs, her footsteps heavy on the wooden steps. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "She's taking this hard," he said, more to himself than to Catherine. "I understand," Catherine replied. "She's protective of you." "As she should be." She paused, then added, "Before I go, though, I'd like to help somehow. Maybe we could work on one of the cars together?" Daniel looked at her in surprise. Her designer clothes and manicured nails seemed at odds with the idea of auto repair. "You want to work on cars?" Catherine smiled, a genuine warmth reaching her eyes. "I may have been a CEO, but I'm not afraid of getting my hands dirty. Besides, it might be nice to learn something new." Against his better judgment, Daniel found himself nodding. "I've got Mrs. Peterson's Buick that needs work. Could use an extra pair of hands." They moved to the garage, where the morning sun cast long shadows through the dusty windows. The Buick sat waiting, its hood already propped open. Catherine rolled up her sleeves, and Daniel couldn't help but notice how different she looked from the corporate executive who had fired him years ago. "Here," he said, handing her a wrench. "We'll start with something simple." As they worked, Catherine asked questions about the engine, listening intently to his explanations. Her genuine interest surprised him, and he found himself relaxing slightly, falling into the familiar rhythm of teaching someone about cars. "You know," Catherine said, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of grease, "I always admired your technical skills." "Even back then," Daniel tensed, the old hurt rising in his chest. "Didn't stop you from letting me go." Catherine's hand stilled on the wrench. "No, it didn't. I made decisions then that I thought were right for the company. I was wrong about so many things." "It wasn't just a job," Daniel said, his voice tight. "It was my whole life. My future. Lila's future." "I know that now," Catherine replied quietly. "Working with the foundation, I've seen firsthand how corporate decisions affect real people, real families." She met his eyes. "I wish I'd understood that then." Before Daniel could respond, they heard a sharp intake of breath from the garage doorway. Lila stood there, her face a mask of hurt and anger. "How can you just stand there talking to her like everything's okay?" Lila demanded, her voice trembling. "After what she did to us." "Lila," Daniel started, but she cut him off. "No, she ruined everything. We had to move away from our home, start over with nothing, and now she's just here? Acting like she's our friend?" Catherine took a step forward. "Lila, don't." Lila's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to hear it. Just leave us alone." She turned and ran back into the house, her footsteps thundering up the stairs. The sound of her bedroom door slamming echoed through the walls. Daniel stood frozen, the wrench heavy in his hand. The progress he'd felt moments ago evaporated, replaced by the weight of his daughter's pain. Catherine stood quietly beside him, grease still smudged on her forehead, her expression a mixture of guilt and sorrow. "I should go talk to her," Daniel said finally, setting down the wrench. "Of course," Catherine nodded, stepping back. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I never meant to cause more pain." Daniel looked at her, seeing both the powerful executive who had changed his life with a single decision and the humbled woman who now stood in his garage, trying to make amends. The conflict inside him twisted deeper. "I know," he said simply, before heading toward the house, leaving Catherine alone in the garage with the half-repaired Buick and the weight of unresolved history hanging in the air. The steps creaked under his feet as he climbed toward his daughter's room, each step feeling heavier than the last. He could hear Lila's muffled sobs through the door, and his heart ached with the familiar feeling of being torn between his instinct to protect his daughter and the growing understanding that sometimes healing required facing the very thing that caused the pain in the first place. Daniel sat at his workbench, staring at the crumpled envelope in his hands. The logo of Mitchell's Premium Auto Services was emblazoned across the top, the paper worn from being folded and unfolded countless times throughout the day. Inside lay an offer that could change everything: a position as head mechanic at their downtown location in Boise, complete with benefits and a salary that would make life considerably easier for him and Lila. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty garage windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The familiar smell of motor oil and grease surrounded him, a comfort he'd grown accustomed to over the years. This small shop had been his sanctuary, a place where broken things could be fixed, even when his own life felt beyond repair. Catherine's soft footsteps echoed through the garage. "Daniel?" She called out, her voice hesitant. "Lila mentioned you've been out here all afternoon." He looked up, noting how different she appeared from the corporate executive who had fired him years ago. Gone was the sharp business suit and commanding presence. Instead, she wore borrowed jeans and one of his old flannel shirts, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. "Just thinking," he replied, running a hand through his graying hair. Catherine moved closer, leaning against a nearby workbench. "About what?" Daniel held up the envelope. "Got a job offer. Mitchell's Auto in Boise. They want me to run their service department." "That's wonderful news," Catherine said, her face brightening. "Mitchell's has an excellent reputation. The opportunity could be exactly what you and Lila need." Daniel stood up, pacing the length of the garage. "Maybe. It's more money, better hours, good school district for Lila." He paused, picking up a wrench and turning it over in his hands. "But this town, it's become home. We built a life here after." He trailed off, not wanting to finish the sentence. Catherine's expression softened with understanding. "After I ruined everything." "That's not what I was going to say," Daniel replied, though they both knew it was true. "Daniel," Catherine said, her voice gentle but firm, "you deserve this opportunity. Don't let the past or me hold you back. You've worked so hard to rebuild your life. Maybe this is God's way of opening a new door for you." He set the wrench down with a loud clang. "And what about you? You're still recovering, dealing with the investigation into your foundation. I can't just—" "Yes, you can," Catherine interrupted. "My problems are my own to solve. You've already shown me more kindness than I deserve." She stepped closer, her eyes meeting his. "Take the job, Daniel. Give Lila the opportunities she deserves. Don't let your sense of obligation to me stand in the way." Daniel looked around the garage at the familiar tools hanging on the wall, the ancient coffee maker in the corner, the stack of repair manuals he'd collected over the years. This place had been his refuge when everything else fell apart. Now, he had the chance to move forward, but something held him back. "I need time to think," he said finally. "Can't make a decision like this without careful consideration." Catherine nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Of course. Just remember, sometimes the hardest choices are the ones most worth making." As the sun began to set, Daniel grabbed his jacket and headed out for a walk through the small town. The streets were quiet, with only a few people hurrying home from work. He passed by Pete's Diner, where he and Lila had shared countless Sunday breakfasts, and the park where she had learned to ride her bike. Main Street looked different in the fading light, the familiar storefronts taking on a nostalgic quality. He remembered arriving here 10 years ago, broken and bitter, with nothing but a few dollars in his pocket and a desperate need to start over. This town had given him that chance. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on his shoulders as he walked. The job offer represented more than just a career move. It was an opportunity to finally leave the past behind. But as he thought about Catherine's situation, her vulnerability, and the strange twist of fate that had brought her back into his life, he wondered if running away was really the answer. He found himself at the small town square, where the local church stood sentinel against the darkening sky. The weathered wooden bench near the church steps had often been his thinking spot during difficult times. He sat down, letting the cool evening air clear his mind. The choice before him seemed impossible. Stay and continue the life he'd built, helping Catherine find her way back from her own mistakes, or take the leap toward a fresh start with his daughter. Both paths held promise and pain, opportunity and sacrifice. As night settled over the quiet town, Daniel decided not to rush the decision. Some choices needed time to breathe, space to be examined from all angles. Tomorrow would be soon enough to weigh his options more carefully. For now, he would let the evening air and the familiar sights of his adopted hometown help him find clarity. The morning sun streamed through Daniel's kitchen window as Catherine paced back and forth, her phone clutched tightly in her trembling hand. Her usually composed demeanor had cracked, revealing a vulnerability that made Daniel pause as he watched her from the doorway. "I found him," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The executive who—" She stopped, collecting herself. "He's in Boise today. I need to confront him, Daniel. I need to face the man who destroyed everything." Daniel's jaw tightened, the same man who had framed him all those years ago. He set down his coffee mug, the ceramic making a hollow sound against the wooden table. What good would that do? Closure, maybe? Catherine's eyes met his, pleading. Would you come with me? I know I have no right to ask, but you don't? Daniel interrupted, more sharply than he intended. The kitchen fell silent except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator. He watched as Catherine's shoulders slumped slightly, accepting his rejection. But something in her defeated posture stirred something in him. Maybe it was his faith telling him to show grace, or perhaps it was the memory of his own sleepless nights, wondering why everything had fallen apart. What time do we need to leave? Relief flooded Catherine's face. 2 hours. Thank you, Daniel. The drive to Boise stretched before them like an endless ribbon of asphalt. Fields of wheat swayed in the breeze on either side of the highway, creating waves of golden light. Catherine sat rigid in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I used to love driving to the city, she said suddenly, breaking the heavy silence. It meant another deal closed, another victory. She laughed, but it was hollow. I was so focused on climbing higher that I never looked down to see who I might be stepping on. Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Like me? Catherine turned to face him, her eyes glistening. You were the first domino, Daniel. After you. After what I did to you, everything started falling apart. It's like the universe was punishing me for my choices. The universe or your conscience? Both? Maybe. She looked out the window again. I started second-guessing every decision. When Thomas the executive suggested more layoffs, I hesitated. That's when he saw his opportunity. Before I knew it, he'd manipulated the books, shifted blame onto me, and I was watching everything I'd built crumble. Daniel stayed silent, processing her words. The road hummed beneath them as they passed a sign announcing Boise was 50 miles away. The worst part wasn't losing the company, Catherine continued, her voice thick with emotion. It was realizing how many lives I'd affected, not just yours, but hundreds of others. People with families, dreams, responsibilities. I told myself it was just business. But it wasn't. Daniel finished for her. No, she whispered. It never was. They arrived at the upscale restaurant where the executive had agreed to meet. The hostess led them to a private booth in the back, where Thomas waited, looking exactly as Daniel remembered him, expensive suit, perfectly coiffed hair, and a smile that never reached his eyes. Catherine, Thomas said smoothly, standing to greet them. His smile faltered when he saw Daniel. And Mr. Harper, isn't it? What an unexpected surprise. Catherine took a deep breath. We need to talk about what happened, Thomas. About the truth. The truth? Thomas laughed, settling back into his seat. The truth is that business is business, Catherine. You got sloppy, made mistakes, and paid the price. That's all there is to it. You know that's not what happened. Catherine's voice shook with barely contained anger. You manipulated everything. You framed Daniel, then you turned on me when I started questioning your methods. Thomas's expression hardened. Prove it. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. You can't, can you? Because I was smarter than both of you. I protected myself while you were too busy playing at being righteous. Daniel watched as Catherine's composure cracked. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. I trusted you, she said. We all did. That was your first mistake. Thomas stood, straightening his tie. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual business to attend to. Unlike some people, I'm still relevant in the corporate world. He tossed some bills on the table. Lunch is on me. Consider it severance pay. As Thomas walked away, Catherine sat frozen, tears streaming down her face. Daniel had imagined this moment differently, he'd thought. Seeing Catherine broken would bring him satisfaction. Instead, he felt only sympathy for the woman who had finally learned the same painful lesson he had years ago. He's never going to admit it, is he? Catherine asked quietly, staring at the empty seat where Thomas had been. He's never going to face what he did to us. Daniel shook his head. Some people don't have the capacity for remorse, Catherine. They just keep moving forward, leaving destruction in their wake. Catherine wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. I wanted so badly to make things right, to fix everything I'd broken. But I can't, can I? Some things just stay broken. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air between them. Daniel understood now that they were both victims of the same man's ruthless ambition, both carrying scars from trusting the wrong person. The realization didn't erase the past, but it shed new light on it. making the burden of their shared history feel somehow different. The drive back from the city felt longer than it should have. Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as his mind replayed the cold, dismissive words of Catherine's former executive. The man hadn't shown an ounce of remorse, treating their visit like an inconvenience rather than a chance for redemption. As Daniel pulled into his driveway, the setting sun cast long shadows across the worn pavement. His modest home looked different, somehow warmer, more inviting after the harsh reality of the city. Lila sat on the front porch, her textbooks spread around her as she worked on homework. "How did it go?" she asked, looking up from her studies. The concern in her voice surprised Daniel. He settled beside her on the porch steps, letting out a heavy sigh. "Not great, honey. Sometimes people don't want to admit when they've done wrong." "What happened?" Lila closed her book, giving him her full attention. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, choosing his words carefully. "The man we met with, he's the one who really caused all the trouble. He hurt both Catherine and me, but he doesn't care. He just sat there in his fancy office, acting like we were wasting his time." "That must have been hard for Catherine," Lila said softly, glancing toward the house where Catherine had retreated to her room. "It was. You should have seen her face when he laughed off everything she said." Daniel shook his head. "She's lost everything because of him, her company, her reputation, her family's trust. And now her foundation might be in trouble too." Lila's expression softened. "I thought she was just some rich lady who hurt you on purpose. But she's hurting too, isn't she?" "Yeah, she is." Daniel wrapped an arm around his daughter's shoulders. "Life isn't always as simple as we think it is." Later that evening, Daniel found Catherine in the kitchen, surrounded by grocery bags. She wore an old apron she must have found in one of the drawers, and her hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail, a far cry from her usual polished appearance. "What's all this?" he asked, gesturing to the supplies spread across the counter. Catherine looked up, a determined expression on her face. "I wanted to do something useful. You've both been so kind, letting me stay here. The least I can do is make dinner." She paused, adding quietly, "And maybe help with some of those repairs you've been putting off. I noticed the back step is loose." Daniel stood there, taken aback by this new side of Catherine. The woman who once commanded boardrooms was now offering to cook dinner and fix his worn-down house. It stirred something in him, not quite forgiveness, but perhaps understanding. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know." She smiled softly. "I want to." Over the next hour, the kitchen filled with the warm aroma of home cooking. Catherine moved with surprising efficiency, chopping vegetables and seasoning chicken like she'd done it 1,000 times before. Daniel found himself helping, passing her ingredients and washing dishes as they worked in comfortable silence. When Lila wandered in, drawn by the smell of dinner, she hesitated at the doorway. Then, to Daniel's surprise, she asked, "Can I help?" Catherine's face lit up. "Of course. Would you like to help me make the salad?" As they worked together, the tension that had filled the house for days began to dissolve. They talked about simple things: school, work, favorite foods. It felt normal. When they finally sat down to eat, the food wasn't perfect, the chicken was a little overdone, and the vegetables were slightly too soft, but somehow that made it better, more real. They were halfway through the meal when Lila set down her fork, her face serious. "Catherine?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "Why did you fire my dad?" The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Daniel started to intervene, but Catherine held up her hand. "No, it's okay," she said, setting down her own fork. "You deserve to know." She took a deep breath, her hands folded in her lap. "I made a terrible mistake. I trusted people I shouldn't have, and I let them convince me that cutting jobs, including your father's position, was the only way to save the company." Catherine's voice wavered slightly. "I was so focused on numbers and profits that I forgot about the people whose lives I was affecting. Your father was one of our best engineers, but when that executive showed me fabricated reports about department inefficiencies, I didn't question them like I should have." She looked directly at Daniel, her eyes glistening. "I'm sorry. I know those words aren't enough, but I need you both to know that not a day goes by that I don't regret the choices I made. Seeing how it affected your lives, knowing the pain I caused, it haunts me." Daniel found himself really listening, perhaps for the first time. He saw not the powerful CEO who had dismissed him years ago, but a woman who had made mistakes and was trying to make amends. The bitterness he'd carried for so long felt different now, not gone, but lighter somehow. Lila reached across the table and touched Catherine's hand. "Thank you for telling us the truth." The simple gesture seemed to break something open in all of them. They sat there in the quiet of the evening, three broken people sharing a meal, finding that maybe, just maybe, healing was possible. The kitchen was quiet except for the soft ticking of the old wall clock and the occasional clink of Catherine's spoon against her coffee mug. She sat at the small wooden table, staring into the dark liquid as if searching for answers. Daniel worked nearby, fixing the leaky faucet that had been dripping for days. Her phone buzzed on the table, making her jump. The caller ID showed her foundation's main office number. Catherine's hand trembled slightly as she answered. "Hello?" Her voice was steady, but her face grew increasingly pale as she listened. "I see. Yes, I understand. No, don't make any decisions yet. I'll figure something out." She ended the call and set the phone down with deliberate care, but her hands were shaking more now. Daniel glanced over, noticing how her shoulders had tensed, how her breathing had become shallow and quick. "Bad news?" he asked, setting down his wrench. Catherine pressed her fingers to her temples. "The Anderson Group is pulling their funding. They were our biggest donor." She swallowed hard. "Without their support, we'll have to shut down most of our programs. All those people we help, single parents, displaced workers, they'll have nowhere to turn." Her voice cracked on the last words, and she pushed back from the table, turning away from Daniel. He could see her struggling to maintain her composure, to hold on to that corporate facade she'd worn for so many years. "I should have seen this coming," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Everything I touch seems to fall apart these days." Daniel dried his hands on a dish towel, considering her words. He remembered the Catherine Langford who had fired him, confident, untouchable, seemingly immune to doubt or regret. This woman before him now was different. Broken, yes, but also more real, more human. "Maybe," he said slowly, "you're just trying to hold everything together on your own." Catherine turned back to face him, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "What choice do I have? After everything that happened with the company, nobody trusts me anymore. And they shouldn't." She laughed bitterly. "I wouldn't trust me either." Daniel leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "You know, this town might surprise you. People here understand what it's like to struggle, to need a second chance." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," he paused, weighing his words carefully. "I'm saying I could help. I know people here, good people. The Auto Shop Owners Association, the church community. They're always looking for ways to give back." Catherine stared at him, confusion clear on her face. "You would do that? After everything?" Daniel moved to sit across from her at the table. "Look, I won't pretend the past didn't happen. You hurt me, and that pain was real." He met her eyes steadily. "But I've watched you these past few weeks. I've seen how much you care about helping others, about making things right. Maybe it's time someone helped you do that." Tears welled up in Catherine's eyes, and this time she didn't try to hide them. "I don't deserve your help, Daniel. I don't deserve anyone's help. Maybe it's not about what we deserve," he said quietly. "Maybe it's about what we choose to do with the chances we're given." He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his contacts. Mike at the hardware store does a charity golf tournament every summer. Sarah at the diner has connections with the local business association. And Pastor Jim, he's always talking about community outreach. Catherine watched him, her coffee forgotten and growing cold. "You're serious about this?" "I am." Daniel set his phone down and looked at her directly. "Your foundation helps people who've been knocked down by life, right? People who need a fresh start?" When she nodded, he continued, "Well, that's pretty much everyone in this town at some point or another. We understand that kind of thing here." Catherine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so unlike her usual polished demeanor that it made her seem younger, more vulnerable. "I never thought. Especially not from you." She took a shaky breath. "I didn't think anyone could forgive me. Not really. Not after everything." "Forgiveness isn't always a single moment," Daniel said. "Sometimes it's a choice we keep making, day after day." He smiled slightly. "So, what do you say? Want to give this town a chance to surprise you?" Catherine looked around the modest kitchen, at the worn but well-loved furniture, at the children's drawings magneted to the refrigerator, at this man who had every reason to turn her away but was instead offering help. Her shoulders straightened, and for the first time since the phone call, real hope flickered in her eyes. "Yes," she said firmly. "Yes, I would like that very much." The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Daniel and Catherine sat at the wooden table, surrounded by papers and notebooks. A fundraising plan was taking shape between them, their heads bent close together as they worked. "If we reach out to the local businesses first," Daniel said, pointing to his list, "we can build momentum before approaching the bigger companies in the city." His finger traced down the names he'd written. Mike at the hardware store, Sarah's diner, even old Thompson's feed store. They all know me. They might be willing to help. Catherine nodded, making notes in her elegant handwriting. "That's brilliant, Daniel. Starting local gives us credibility." She paused, looking up at him with genuine appreciation. "I never would have thought of this approach. In my corporate days, I always went straight for the big donors." "Small towns work differently," Daniel explained, reaching for his coffee mug. "People here care about their neighbors. They help each other out." From the hallway came the sound of footsteps. Lila appeared in the doorway, already dressed for school, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She hesitated when she saw them working together, her expression guarded. "Good morning, sweetheart," Daniel said warmly. "Want some breakfast?" "I'll just grab a granola bar," Lila mumbled, moving to the cupboard. She barely glanced at Catherine, who offered her a gentle smile. "I made some fresh coffee cake this morning, Lila," Catherine ventured. "It's cooling on the counter if you'd like some." Lila stiffened slightly. "No, thanks. I'm running late." She grabbed her snack and headed for the door, her movements quick and precise. "Have a good day at school," Daniel called after her. The only response was the sound of the front door closing. Catherine's face fell slightly. "She's still having a hard time with all this, isn't she?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Give her time. It's a lot of change to process." He turned back to their work, but his eyes kept straying to the door where his daughter had disappeared. They spent the morning making calls and drafting proposals. Daniel's reputation in town proved valuable. Several business owners agreed to meet with them later that week. Catherine watched in amazement as he worked, his genuine warmth and sincerity drawing people in. Around noon, they took a break to make sandwiches. As they ate, Catherine said softly, "You've built something really special here, Daniel. These people trust you completely." "It took time," he admitted. "When we first moved here, I was angry, bitter, didn't want to let anyone in." He met her eyes across the table. "But I learned that holding on to hurt only makes it harder to heal." Catherine's hand trembled slightly as she set down her sandwich. "I wish I'd understood that sooner. All those years in the corporate world, I thought power was everything. I didn't see the value in connections like these." They worked through the afternoon, planning a community event that would showcase the foundation's work. Daniel suggested using the town square, where they could set up booths and maybe even have local musicians perform. "We could make it a real celebration," he said, sketching out a rough layout. "Show people exactly how their donations would help others." Catherine leaned closer to look at his drawing, her shoulder brushing against his. Neither of them pulled away immediately, and the moment stretched between them, comfortable and warm. The front door opened and closed again, Lila returning from school. She paused in the kitchen doorway, taking in the scene before her. Something flickered across her face, uncertainty, perhaps even fear, before she turned away. "I've got homework," she said quickly, heading for her room. "Lila, wait," Daniel called. "Don't you want to hear about the fundraiser we're planning? We could use your ideas." "Maybe later," she replied, her footsteps already retreating down the hall. Daniel's shoulders slumped slightly. Catherine touched his arm gently. "She's protecting you, you know, making sure I don't hurt you again." "I know," he said quietly. "She's carried so much responsibility since her mother died. Sometimes I forget she's still just a kid." They returned to their work, but the mood had shifted slightly. As the afternoon light began to fade, they moved from the kitchen to the living room, spreading their papers across the coffee table. Catherine had removed her shoes, tucking her feet beneath her on the couch as she reviewed their notes. "I think we've got something solid here," she said, suppressing a yawn. "The community event could really work." Daniel nodded, leaning back in his armchair. "It's strange," he mused, "how things work out sometimes. If you'd told me 2 weeks ago that I'd be helping you save your foundation, I wouldn't have believed it either," Catherine admitted. "I spent so many years thinking I had to do everything alone, handle every crisis, by myself." She looked around the modest living room, taking in the family photos, the worn but comfortable furniture. "But there's something powerful about working together, isn't there?" From down the hall came the faint sound of music from Lila's room, her way of creating distance when she needed space to think. Daniel glanced in that direction, concern etched on his face. "She'll come around," Catherine said softly. "Just keep showing her that some changes can be good." They worked until the sky outside turned purple with dusk. Finally, Catherine gathered her papers, organizing them into neat stacks. "Thank you, Daniel, not just for today, but for everything, for seeing past who I used to be." Daniel stood, helping her collect the last of their notes. Maybe we both needed to learn how to see things differently. The moment hung between them, full of unspoken understanding. Through the window, crickets had begun their evening chorus, a gentle reminder of how long they'd been working. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, they had made a start. Not just on saving the foundation, but on building something neither of them had expected: trust. The community center's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Daniel and Catherine stood before a nearly empty room. Only 5 people had shown up to their fundraising presentation, including Mike from the hardware store, who kept checking his watch. The stack of carefully prepared information packets sat largely untouched on the fold-out table. Catherine's voice wavered slightly as she continued her presentation. "With your support, we can create programs that will help displaced workers rebuild their lives." She gestured to the PowerPoint slide showing success stories from other communities. No one seemed particularly moved. Daniel watched from the back of the room, his heart sinking. He'd promised her this would work, that his connections in the community would come through, but the empty chairs told a different story. After 15 more painful minutes, the small audience filed out with polite but non-committal murmurs. Mike paused by the door. "Sorry, Daniel, times are tough right now. Maybe next quarter." He shrugged apologetically and left. Catherine stood frozen by the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered her papers. The sound of shuffling paper echoed in the empty room. "I'll start cleaning up," Daniel said softly, beginning to fold chairs. Catherine nodded, not meeting his eyes. I really thought this would work." Her voice cracked. "I had everything planned out. The programs we could offer, the lives we could change." She sank into a nearby chair, the papers slipping from her grasp and scattering across the floor. Daniel set down the chair he was holding and knelt to help gather the fallen documents. "Catherine, this is just one setback. We can try again." "Try again?" She laughed bitterly. "Look around, Daniel. Nobody came. Nobody cares about what we're trying to do here." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Maybe this is karma. Maybe I deserve this after everything I've done." "That's not true," Daniel insisted, but Catherine was already standing up, pacing the room. "The foundation is running out of money. Without new funding, we'll have to close our doors in 3 months." She ran her fingers through her hair, her carefully maintained composure crumbling. "All those people depending on us. I'm failing them just like I failed you." Daniel reached for her arm, but she pulled away. The distance between them suddenly felt vast, like all their progress over the past weeks was unraveling. "I should have known better," she continued. "Who would trust someone like me? The disgraced CEO who ruined lives? I'm toxic, Daniel. Everything I touch falls apart." "Stop it," Daniel said firmly. "This isn't the Catherine Langford I've come to know. The woman who's been working tirelessly to make things right, who's shown such kindness to my daughter, who's faced every challenge with determination." But Catherine wasn't listening. She walked to the window, staring out at the darkening parking lot. "I thought I could change things, make up for my mistakes. But look at us. You're still stuck in this small town because of what I did, and I'm still trying to fix things that can't be fixed." Daniel felt his own frustration rising. "Is that what you think? That I'm stuck here? This town gave me a second chance when I needed it most. These people, who you think don't care, they helped me rebuild my life. And now they won't even give me 5 minutes of their time," Catherine said quietly. "Maybe that tells you everything you need to know about me." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Daniel watched as Catherine methodically packed her briefcase, her movements mechanical, her eyes distant. "I need some time to think," she said finally, "to figure out what to do next." "Catherine, wait. Please, Daniel." Her voice was barely a whisper. I can't right now." He watched helplessly as she walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. Each step seemed to echo their failure, their fragile trust stretching thin. But something in Daniel refused to let it end this way. "I'm not giving up," he called after her. "We'll find another way. Different investors, maybe a crowdfunding campaign. Something." Catherine paused at the doorway but didn't turn around. Her shoulders were slumped in defeat, so different from the confident woman who had entered the room hours earlier. "Why do you still want to help me?" she asked softly. "After everything?" Daniel took a deep breath. "Because I've learned that second chances aren't just about forgiveness. They're about believing people can change. And you have changed, Catherine, even if you can't see it right now." She didn't respond, just stood there for a long moment before finally walking out. The door closed behind her with a quiet click, leaving Daniel alone in the community center. He looked around at the half-cleaned room, the scattered chairs, the abandoned presentation materials, the coffee cups still sitting on the refreshment table. It all seemed to mock their optimism from just hours ago. But as he began to clean up, his movements became more determined. He wouldn't let this be the end. There had to be another way, and he would find it. Not just for Catherine, but for all the people who needed help, who deserved a second chance, just like he'd gotten. The room grew darker as the sun set outside, but Daniel kept working, his mind already turning over new possibilities. Sometimes, he thought, the hardest part of forgiveness was learning to forgive yourself. And maybe that was the real lesson Catherine needed to learn, one he was determined to help her understand, no matter how long it took. Daniel's truck rumbled down Main Street early Monday morning, the bed loaded with handmade signs and flyers. He pulled up to Jerry's Diner, where the morning crowd was just settling in for coffee and breakfast. The bell chimed as he pushed through the door, nodding to familiar faces. "Morning, Jerry," he called out to the owner, who was working the grill. "Got a minute?" Jerry wiped his hands on his apron and came around the counter. Daniel explained about Catherine's nonprofit and their mission to help displaced workers get back on their feet. He pulled out some flyers, showing Jerry the programs they wanted to implement. "You know how hard it was for me when I first came here?" Daniel said quietly. "There are lots of folks going through the same thing right now." Jerry studied the flyer, then looked up at Daniel with knowing eyes. "This have anything to do with that woman staying at your place?" "Catherine's trying to make things right," Daniel replied. "She's changed, Jerry. I've seen it myself." After some consideration, Jerry nodded. "Put up your flyers. I'll talk to my suppliers about donating to your next event." Throughout the day, Daniel visited every business in town. Some people were skeptical, but many remembered how the community had helped him years ago. By afternoon, he had commitments from the hardware store, the grocery, and several other shops. Back at home, he found Catherine at the kitchen table, surrounded by paperwork. Her shoulders were slumped, but she straightened when he walked in. "How did it go?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Daniel smiled. "We've got 7 businesses on board so far, and the church agreed to host another meeting this Friday." Catherine's eyes widened. "Really? After last time? People here believe in second chances," he said. "They gave me one when I needed it most." Over the next few days, they worked together preparing for the meeting. Catherine practiced her presentation while Daniel helped her simplify the message. Lila even pitched in, creating colorful posters with before and after stories of people the nonprofit had already helped. Friday evening arrived, and the church basement slowly filled with familiar faces. Daniel noticed Catherine's hands trembling as she arranged her notes at the podium. The turnout was better this time. At least 30 people, including several business owners and community leaders. Catherine took a deep breath and stepped up to speak. But instead of launching into her prepared speech about statistics and programs, she paused. Then she did something unexpected. 10 years ago, she began, her voice soft but clear, "I made a terrible mistake. I was so focused on corporate success that I forgot about the human cost of my decisions. I fired good people, including someone in this very room, because they didn't fit into my vision of progress." The room grew still. Daniel felt his chest tighten as several people glanced his way. "I lost everything," Catherine continued. "My company, my reputation, my sense of purpose. But that loss taught me what really matters. This nonprofit isn't just about helping displaced workers. It's about redemption. It's about recognizing that everyone deserves a chance to rebuild their life." She gestured to Daniel. "This man had every reason to turn me away when I needed help. Instead, he showed me what true forgiveness looks like. That's the spirit I want this organization to embody." Mrs. Peterson, who owned the local bakery, raised her hand. "What exactly would our donations fund?" Catherine explained their plans for job training programs, resume workshops, and emergency assistance for families in crisis. This time, people leaned forward, nodding along. They asked questions about specific programs and implementation details. By the end of the meeting, 12 more businesses had pledged support. The hardware store offered to donate supplies for their training workshops. The local community college expressed interest in partnering for certification programs. As people filed out, many stopped to shake Catherine's hand. Mrs. Peterson even hugged her, whispering something that made Catherine's eyes well up with tears. After everyone left, Catherine and Daniel sat in the empty church basement. The success of the evening hung in the air between them, a shared victory that felt both surprising and inevitable. "Thank you," Catherine said softly. "I couldn't have done this without you." Daniel shook his head. "You just needed to find your voice again, to remember why you started this work in the first place." "It's more than that," she insisted. "You helped me see that my past mistakes don't have to define my future, that there's always hope for change." They gathered their materials in comfortable silence, both aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. The bitterness that had colored their early interactions had transformed into something else, a partnership built on mutual respect and understanding. As they loaded the last box into Daniel's truck, Catherine paused. "You know, when I first started this nonprofit, I thought it was about making amends. But now I realize it's about something bigger. It's about creating the kind of community I wish had existed when everything fell apart." Daniel nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Sometimes the path to healing led through helping others heal too. Morning sun streamed through Daniel's kitchen windows as he prepared breakfast. Coffee and pancake aromas filled the air while Catherine reviewed nonprofit paperwork. Their comfortable silence showed how far they'd come since the accident. "These numbers are amazing," Catherine said, looking up with bright eyes. "The community center program is helping twice as many families as projected." Daniel flipped a pancake. "People here look out for each other. Once they understood your goals, they wanted to help." Catherine traced her coffee mug's edge. "I never thought I'd find this purpose again. After everything fell apart, I was so focused on success that I forgot what really matters." Daniel placed pancakes before her, studying her face. The sharp businesswoman had been replaced by someone gentler, more authentic. Designer suits were gone, replaced by casual clothes reflecting her changed heart. "Sometimes we have to lose everything to find what we're looking for," he said. "Like when you moved here?" "Yeah. It wasn't easy, but starting over taught me what strength really means." Lila's footsteps interrupted them. She appeared dressed for school, backpack over her shoulder. For weeks, she'd watched her father and Catherine grow closer, distrust gradually giving way to something else. "Morning, Dad," she said, then smiled at Catherine. "Morning, Catherine." "Good morning, sweetheart," Catherine replied warmly, though Daniel heard uncertainty. She was always careful with Lila, aware of the teenager's complicated feelings. Lila grabbed a pancake and sat between them. Instead of eating, she seemed lost in thought, playing with her fork. Finally, she took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about everything since you came here." Daniel set down his coffee, giving full attention. Catherine sat still, waiting. "At first, I was angry," Lila continued. "I knew what happened before, how Dad struggled after losing his job. I didn't want to give you a chance." Catherine nodded without defense. "That was completely understandable, but I've been watching you both. I've seen how hard you've worked to make things right, not just with the nonprofit, but with us." She turned to her father. "Dad, you smile more now. You're different." Daniel felt his throat tighten. His daughter's perceptive words struck deep. "What I'm trying to say is, I forgive you, Catherine. I trust you now. You've shown us who you really are, and I'm glad you're here." Catherine's eyes welled with tears. She reached across hesitantly, taking Lila's hand. "Thank you. That means more than you could know." Daniel watched them, feeling something shift inside. His daughter's forgiveness unlocked the last door in his heart. "She's right. I forgive you too, Catherine. Completely." The words hung powerfully in the air. Catherine covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Years of guilt seemed to lift from her shoulders. That evening, after Lila went to bed, Daniel and Catherine sat on the front porch. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, casting warmth over the quiet street. Gentle breeze carried blooming jasmine scent. "I never expected this," Catherine said softly, hands wrapped around tea. "When my car went off the road that night, I thought it was just another disaster." Daniel leaned back, watching clouds drift across darkening sky. "God works in mysterious ways. Sometimes the worst moments lead us exactly where we need to be." "A second chance," Catherine murmured, glancing at him. For all of us, Daniel corrected, thinking of Lila's morning words. The three had each found healing unexpectedly. They sat in comfortable silence as sunlight faded. First stars appeared, twinkling against deepening blue. Both felt the weight of their shared journey, from anger to understanding, hurt to healing, broken trust to something precious. The porch light flickered on automatically. Crickets began their evening chorus. These simple, small-town sounds felt like music to Catherine's ears, so different from her former corporate world's constant noise. "Thank you," she said suddenly, facing Daniel, "for giving me the chance to make things right, for showing me what real strength looks like." Daniel smiled, the kind that reached his eyes and erased old pain traces. "Thank you for having courage to change. It's not easy admitting when we're wrong." A car passed slowly, headlights sweeping across the porch. In that brief illumination, they saw each other clearly, two people who had traveled far from where they started, finding redemption in the most unexpected place. Catherine stared at her phone, her hand trembling slightly as she set it down on Daniel's kitchen table. The morning light caught the worry lines etched across her forehead. She'd just received news that could change everything. Horizon Foundation, one of the largest charitable organizations in the country, wanted to absorb her nonprofit. Daniel noticed her distress as he flipped the last pancake onto a plate. "Everything okay?" he asked, setting the breakfast down between them. I just got off the phone with James Anderson from Horizon Foundation," Catherine said, her voice unsteady. "They want to take over our nonprofit, full acquisition, complete integration into their organization." Daniel pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "That's a big deal," he said carefully, studying her face. "What exactly are they offering?" Catherine ran her fingers through her hair, a gesture Daniel had come to recognize as a sign of her inner turmoil. "Everything we could want, really. Financial stability, infrastructure, nationwide reach. They'd keep all our current programs running and expand them to other communities." She picked up her coffee mug but didn't drink from it. "They'd want me to oversee the transition and then take a position as their regional director in Seattle." The word Seattle hung heavy in the air between them. Daniel's hands tightened almost imperceptibly around his own coffee mug. "Seattle," he repeated softly. "That's quite a change from our little town." "It is," Catherine agreed, finally looking up to meet his eyes. "The position comes with an impressive salary, benefits, everything I used to have back in my corporate days. It would mean security, stability." She trailed off, her voice catching slightly. "But," Daniel prompted gently, "but it wouldn't be this." She gestured around the modest kitchen, where they'd shared so many conversations over the past weeks. "It wouldn't be working directly with the people we help. It would be managing spreadsheets, attending board meetings, dealing with bureaucracy." The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Lila's arrival. She walked into the kitchen, immediately sensing the tension. "What's wrong?" she asked, looking between them. Catherine explained the situation to Lila, whose face fell slightly at the mention of Seattle. The teenager had grown close to Catherine, often helping with the nonprofit's local projects after school. "You can't leave," Lila blurted out, then caught herself, looking embarrassed. "I mean, the community center project isn't even finished yet." Catherine reached out and squeezed Lila's hand. "I know, sweetie. That's what makes this so hard." Daniel stood up and began gathering dishes, his movements deliberate and measured. "Why don't we all take a walk after breakfast? Clear our heads a bit?" The suggestion was welcome, and soon they found themselves strolling through the town park. The morning was crisp, with autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet. They passed the community center they'd been renovating, Catherine's latest project to provide resources for local families in need. Catherine stopped in front of the building, her eyes taking in the half-finished paint job and the new windows they'd installed just last weekend. "When I started this nonprofit," she said quietly, "it was about making amends, about trying to right my wrongs. But somewhere along the way, it became about more than that." Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It became about connection, about being part of something real." "Exactly," Catherine agreed, turning to face him. "Horizon Foundation does amazing work, but it's all so institutional. Here, we know everyone we help by name. We see the direct impact of our work." They continued walking, passing familiar faces who waved and called out greetings. Each interaction seemed to weigh on Catherine's decision. Back at Daniel's house, they sat on the porch steps, the same steps where they'd shared so many meaningful conversations. Lila had gone inside to work on homework, leaving them alone with their thoughts. "Can I be honest with you?" Daniel asked, breaking the contemplative silence. Catherine nodded, wrapping her arms around herself against the autumn chill. "When you first showed up here, I thought I knew exactly who you were," he continued. "The ruthless executive who'd ruin my career without a second thought. But watching you these past weeks, seeing how you interact with the people here, how you've helped transform lives, including mine and Lila's, that's shown me who you really are." Catherine's eyes welled with tears. "And who is that?" "Someone who's found her true purpose," Daniel said simply. "Someone who's learned that the biggest impact often comes from the smallest acts of kindness." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "The question is, what does your heart tell you about this decision?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment, watching a fallen leaf dance across the yard in the breeze. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "My heart tells me that I can't leave, not just because of you and Lila, though you're both important to me, but because this work, the real, hands-on, person-to-person work we do here, this is what gives my life meaning now." She pulled out her phone and began composing an email to Horizon Foundation. "I'm going to thank them for the offer, but decline. Our little nonprofit might not have their resources or reach, but we have something they can't match, genuine connection with our community." Daniel watched as she typed, a mix of pride and relief washing over him. "You're sure about this?" Catherine hit send and tucked her phone away. "I've never been more sure of anything," she said, smiling genuinely for the first time that morning. "My place is here, doing the work that matters most." The morning sun painted Daniel's kitchen in warm golden hues as Catherine stood at the counter, making coffee. Her decision to stay, to reject Horizon Foundation's generous offer, filled her with an unexpected lightness. Through the window, she watched Daniel tinkering with an old Chevy in the driveway, his movements sure and steady. "Need any help?" she called out, stepping onto the front porch with 2 steaming mugs. Daniel looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. Perfect timing. He accepted the coffee with a grateful smile, one that reached his eyes in a way that made Catherine's heart skip. These small moments had become precious to her, replacing the cold boardroom meetings and endless paperwork of her past life. "I've been thinking," Daniel said, leaning against the truck. "The community center downtown, the one that's been empty for years, it would make a perfect headquarters for your nonprofit." Catherine's eyes lit up. "Really? But wouldn't the renovation costs be—" "I know some folks," Daniel interrupted, his voice warm with possibility. "Good people who'd be willing to help. Mike from the hardware store, Sarah who runs the painting business. They're all looking for ways to give back." They spent the morning sketching plans on the back of an old receipt, their heads bent together, coffee growing cold and forgotten. Catherine marveled at how natural it felt, working side by side with the man she'd once wronged so terribly. The past still lingered, but like an old photograph fading in the sun, its sharp edges had softened. Later that afternoon, they drove to the community center. The building needed work, broken windows, peeling paint, creaky floorboards. But Catherine could see its potential through Daniel's eyes. As they walked through the dusty rooms, their footsteps echoing, Daniel pointed out where they could set up counseling offices, job training spaces, a daycare center for single parents. "You really think we can do this?" Catherine asked, running her hand along a wall. Daniel turned to her, his expression serious. "I know we can. Together." The word "together" hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. They'd come so far from that stormy night when he'd found her on the roadside. The bitterness that had once colored their every interaction had transformed into something else entirely: trust, understanding, and maybe something more. Back at home, they found Lila in the kitchen, homework spread across the table. She looked up as they entered, her face brightening. "How was the community center?" "It needs work," Catherine admitted, settling into a chair beside her. "But your dad thinks, we think," Daniel corrected gently. "We think it could be perfect," Catherine finished, sharing a smile with him. Lila closed her textbook, leaning forward eagerly. "Can I help? I could paint or organize stuff, or maybe help with the younger kids once it's running." The enthusiasm in her voice brought tears to Catherine's eyes. This girl, who had once regarded her with such suspicion, now wanted to be part of her mission. Daniel must have noticed her emotion because he squeezed her shoulder as he passed, a gesture of quiet support. They spent the evening planning, dreams and ideas flowing freely around the kitchen table. Lila suggested art classes for the kids, while Daniel mapped out the renovation timeline. Catherine watched them both, her heart full. This was what she'd been searching for all those years in the corporate world. Not power or success, but connection, purpose, family. As the sky darkened outside, Daniel ordered pizza, a Friday night tradition, he explained. They gathered in the living room, the box balanced on the coffee table between them. Lila regaled them with stories from school, her laughter infectious. Catherine found herself joining in, sharing funny memories from her own teenage years, while Daniel added his own humorous commentary. The simple joy of sharing a meal, of belonging somewhere, wrapped around Catherine like a warm blanket. She looked at Daniel, caught him already watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. Lila, noticing their shared glance, rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "You know," Lila said, reaching for another slice. "I'm really glad you stayed, Catherine." "Me too, sweetheart," Catherine replied softly. "Me too." The evening wound down slowly, comfortably. They worked together to clean up, moving around each other with the ease of people who had found their rhythm. Through the window, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, twinkling with possibility. This was home, Catherine realized. Not the luxurious penthouse she'd once owned, or the corner office with its city views, but this modest house with its slightly squeaky floors and walls full of memories. Here, with Daniel and Lila, she'd found something far more valuable than anything she'd lost. She'd found a second chance at happiness, at family, at love. Together, they had transformed their pain into purpose, their past hurts into hope for others. As Catherine watched Daniel and Lila argue playfully over the last piece of pizza, she knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice in staying. Some decisions changed everything, and this one had changed her life in the most beautiful way possible. Daniel stood at the window of his workshop, watching the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. His weathered hands absently traced the edge of an old wrench as his mind drifted back to that stormy night 6 months ago. The memory of finding Catherine, broken and unconscious by the roadside, felt like something from another lifetime. He glanced at the dent in his truck's fender, the one he'd gotten while pulling over to help her. He'd never bothered to fix it, and now it served as a reminder of how life could change in an instant. Back then, his heart had been as dented as that fender, scarred by years of resentment and hurt. "Dad?" Lila's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of steaming coffee. "Catherine sent me to get you. The ceremony starts in an hour." Daniel accepted the coffee with a grateful smile. His daughter's eyes sparkled with excitement, so different from the guarded look she'd worn when Catherine first entered their lives. "Thanks, sweetheart. Just finishing up here." The community center had transformed over the past few months. What was once an abandoned building now buzzed with life and purpose. Daniel remembered the long days of renovation, Catherine in old jeans and a t-shirt, covered in paint, Lila organizing volunteer groups, the whole town coming together to help rebuild not just a building, but lives. As he locked up the workshop, Daniel caught sight of Catherine across the street, directing the setup for today's celebration. She moved with confidence, but not the cold authority she'd possessed in her corporate days. This was different, a warmth that drew people in, made them believe in second chances. "The banners aren't straight," Catherine called out to a volunteer, her laugh carrying across the morning air. She looked up and caught Daniel watching her. The smile she gave him made his heart do that familiar skip it had started doing lately. Inside the community center, the transformation was even more striking. Photos lined the walls, before and after shots of the renovation, but more importantly, pictures of the people they'd helped. Single parents who'd found jobs through their training programs, kids thriving in the after-school center, families rebuilding their lives. Can you believe it? Catherine appeared beside him, her shoulder brushing his as they looked at the photos. 6 months ago, this was just an empty building. Daniel shook his head, marveling not just at the physical changes, but at the deeper transformation that had occurred. "Sometimes the best things come from the hardest moments," he said softly. The ceremony was set to celebrate their first major milestone. 50 families helped back on their feet, 20 new local businesses supported, and a community changed for the better. But Daniel knew the real victory wasn't in the numbers. It was in the way Catherine's eyes shone when she talked about their work. It was in how Lila had found her own passion for helping others. It was in the peace he'd found in finally letting go of his anger. People began filling the main hall, their chatter creating a warm buzz of excitement. Daniel watched as Catherine moved through the crowd, greeting everyone by name, remembering their stories. She'd come so far from the corporate executive who'd once fired him without a second thought. That woman would never have known the names of her janitor's children or spent weekends helping a single mom move into her first apartment. The ceremony began with Lila leading a group of kids in a song they'd prepared. Daniel's chest tightened with pride as he watched his daughter, remembering how she'd once been so hurt and angry about their past with Catherine. Now she was teaching art classes at the center, helping other children find their voice through creativity. Catherine took the podium, her voice steady but filled with emotion as she addressed the crowd. 6 months ago, I thought I'd lost everything, she began. My company, my reputation, my purpose. Then a car accident brought me to this town, to people who taught me that sometimes losing everything is just the beginning of finding something better. Her eyes found Daniel's in the crowd, and the look they shared spoke volumes. He remembered their first real conversation after she'd recognized him. The anger, the guilt, the pain on both sides. How different things were now. This center isn't just about providing services, Catherine continued. It's about second chances. It's about believing that our past mistakes don't have to define our future. And it's about the power of forgiveness to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. After the speeches and presentations, Daniel found himself standing with Catherine and Lila near the refreshment table. Lila was excitedly showing them her plans for expanding the art program, her enthusiasm infectious. I was thinking, she said, maybe we could start a mentorship program? Pair up kids with local artists and business owners? Catherine's face lit up. That's brilliant, Lila. We could. Daniel watched them bounce ideas back and forth, these two people who had become the center of his world in such unexpected ways. The bitterness that had once consumed him had been replaced by something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Pure, unlimited hope for the future. A small crowd gathered around them, sharing stories of how the center had impacted their lives. Catherine listened intently to each one, her hand finding Daniel's and squeezing it gently. The gesture felt natural, right? Like everything else that had grown between them. Thank you, Catherine said, quietly when they had a moment alone. For helping me see the beauty in starting over, for showing me what real success looks like. Lila joined them, slipping her arm through Daniel's. We make a pretty good team, don't we? The three of them moved to the large windows overlooking the town. The morning sun had given way to a bright afternoon, casting a golden glow over the streets below. Daniel looked at their reflection in the glass. His daughter, the woman who had once been his enemy but was now so much more, and himself. The man in the reflection looked younger somehow, unburdened. You know what I've learned? Daniel said, his voice thoughtful. Forgiveness isn't just about letting go of anger. It's about making room for something better. Lila leaned her head against his shoulder. Like family? Like family, he agreed, feeling Catherine's hand slip into his. They stood there together, watching their town spread out before them, each lost in thoughts of how far they'd come and the journey still ahead. The future stretched out before them, bright with possibility, and Daniel knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The autumn morning painted the small Idaho town in rich golds and deep reds. Leaves crunched beneath Daniel's boots as he made his way across the nonprofit's newly renovated community center. The building, once an abandoned warehouse, now stood as a beacon of hope in their community. Sunlight streamed through the freshly cleaned windows, casting warm patches on the polished wooden floors. Catherine stood at the front desk, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed some paperwork. She looked up when Daniel entered, her face brightening with a warm smile that still made his heart skip a beat. Gone was the sharp-suited corporate executive he'd once known. In her place stood a woman whose elegant grace now came from a place of genuine humility and purpose. "Good morning," she said, setting down her pen. "I was just going through the numbers from last month's outreach program. We helped 35 families get back on their feet." Daniel walked over and squeezed her hand. "That's amazing. Remember when we thought we might not even get this place off the ground? Sometimes I still can't believe how far we've come," Catherine admitted, leaning into him slightly. "From that stormy night when you found me on the road to this." The past few months had transformed their lives in ways neither could have imagined. The nonprofit had become a cornerstone of the community, offering job training, support groups, and emergency assistance to families in crisis. But more than that, it had become the foundation upon which Daniel and Catherine had built something precious and unexpected, a second chance at happiness. Lila burst through the front door, her backpack slung over one shoulder. At 16, she'd grown into a compassionate young woman who spent most of her free time helping at the center. "Dad! Catherine! You won't believe what happened at school today." She rushed over to them, her eyes bright with excitement. "Remember that fundraising idea I mentioned? Well, the student council approved it. We're going to organize a career fair here at the center, connecting local businesses with people who need jobs." Catherine wrapped an arm around Lila's shoulders, pride evident in her expression. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. You've really taken initiative with this." Daniel watched his daughter and Catherine together, his heart full. The bitter memories of the past had faded, replaced by countless moments of shared laughter, mutual support, and growing love. The woman he'd once blamed for destroying his life had become instrumental in making it whole again. Later that afternoon, they walked through the center's vegetable garden, another of their successful projects. Community members tended the plots, sharing the harvest and learning sustainable living skills. The setting sun cast long shadows across the rows of autumn vegetables, and a cool breeze rustled through the remaining leaves on the trees. "Sometimes I wonder," Catherine said softly, her hand finding Daniel's, "if everything that happened, even the painful parts, was leading us here." Daniel squeezed her hand, remembering the anger that had once consumed him. "You know what? I think you're right. All those years I spent holding on to resentment. I never imagined forgiveness would bring me so much peace." Lila joined them, carrying a basket of fresh vegetables for the center's cooking class the next day. "Remember when I could barely look at Catherine?" she asked, shaking her head with a small laugh. "Now I can't imagine our family without her." The word family hung in the air, sweet and true. They'd become exactly that, not through blood or obligation, but through choice and love and the daily decision to believe in second chances. They walked together toward the center's entrance, where warm light spilled out onto the sidewalk. Inside, volunteers were setting up for tomorrow's job training session. The walls, once bare, now displayed success stories, photographs of people who'd found new beginnings through their program. Daniel paused at the doorway, taking in the sight of everything they'd built together. The bitter engineer who'd lost everything had become a man who'd gained more than he'd ever dreamed possible. Catherine, once driven by corporate success, had found fulfillment in helping others rebuild their lives. And Lila had grown into a young woman whose heart for service made him prouder than any academic achievement could. Standing there, hand in hand with Catherine, watching Lila arrange the vegetables for tomorrow's class, Daniel felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. The road that had brought them here had been winding and sometimes painful, but it had led them exactly where they needed to be. "Some roads lead us to places we never expected," he said quietly, "but they bring us exactly where we need to be." Catherine squeezed his hand, and Lila came to stand beside them. Together, they stood in the doorway of their shared future, a family united by love, faith, and redemption. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel Harper, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.